Was Melkor evil because of a girl? Melkor was the first great Dark Lord of Middle-earth, and he was the single most evil figure in all of Tolkien's creation. After all, he was the one initially responsible for corrupting Sauron. But why was Melkor so evil? We often thought of this question. It seems like the answer is simple enough, as it's written in the first 10 pages of the Silmarillion, Tolkien's great history of Arda and Ea. But perhaps there's more. There's one line in particular from Tolkien's history of the gods of Earth that is often overlooked, and in it, we find that Melkor originally sought the attention of a girl, and she rejected him. Who was it? And was that one of the big reasons behind Melkor's war against the other Valar? That's what we're going to find out. Before we get going, we have to remember exactly what Melkor was like before he came to Earth. In the time, before the universe itself was born, Melkor lived in the Timeless Halls with Eru Ilúvatar. Ilúvatar was the creator of everything that was and ever will be. He is more or less the main god of the Tolkien universe. Since he created everything, he also made Melkor, along with an entire multitude of similarly angelic beings, which were initially known as the Ainur. Now, the creation of the Ainur wasn't the same as Eru's later creations like elves or men. The Ainur actually sprang from the thoughts of Eru, each one coming from a unique passion or aspect of Eru's mind. Of the angelic Ainur, there were beings who loved creating tools and crafts like Aule, those who were talented at leadership like Manwë, and others who were drawn to physical competition like Tulkas. Each of these lesser gods was a unique thought given life, and so they each uniquely reflected Eru. And you have to ask, how does this relate to Melkor? Well, even within the Supreme Creator himself, even within Eru Ilúvatar, there was a rebellious side. An urge to not follow others and to do what he wanted. It is from this part of Eru that Melkor probably came. And it's actually pretty tragic when you think of it. In a way, it wasn't even Melkor's fault for becoming the great scourge of Middle-earth. He was, after all, just shaped in the figure of his father, and was only doing what his father would have done himself. I mean, Ilúvatar created the entire host of angelic Ainur and the entire universe based on his own desires. So if he was allowed to do it, it seemed pretty selfish to not allow the other Ainur, like Melkor, to have a shot at creation themselves. Since Melkor came from the part of Eru Ilúvatar that basically wanted to create things by himself, you can see how this would lead him to becoming the greatest Dark Lord of Middle-earth. Now, before the universe was created, and there was just Eru Ilúvatar and the Ainur, Eru presented a musical theme to his angelic Ainur. And together they tried to play it, but Melkor, he kept disrupting them. He basically kept playing offbeat or going on these really weird long solos, and it completely disrupted every session. And after trying to rein him in a few times, Ilúvatar just gave up. He reprimanded Melkor and told him that he understood Melkor's desire to make things, Eru explained how futile it was though, since after all everything that was or ever would be was fully controlled by Eru Ilúvatar. Now, shortly after this, Eru took the Ainur's music and transformed it. Like a sculptor inspired by his favorite jazz song, Eru conceived of a physical shape for the music that he and the Ainur had played and brought it into existence. This was the birth of the universe, and the universe in Tolkien's world is known as Ea. And it was from this point that members of the Ainur would leave the Timeless Halls and descend into the physical realm to begin their hard work as earthly gods. Now, up to this point, we've only established that Melkor was evil because he was rebellious pretty much, that his evil was based on being too much like his father, that he wanted to independently create creatures and worlds. But what does that have to do with a girl? Well, before the Ainur learned how to play together, they struggled to conceive of the other members of the gods. Remember, they were just thoughts given life, so they were more or less consumed with figuring out their very own nature before they could move on to considering that there were other beings out there besides themselves. They were just pretty much babies. And while they were doing that, and Eru was first teaching them how to make music, Melkor approached a goddess known as Varda. And as you might know, Varda would later become the wife of Manwë, king of gods on Earth. And this is important because Manwë is also Melkor's closest rival and actually his brother of sorts, more so than the other Valar gods. Again, as we said before, Melkor often tried to attract the other gods to his way of thinking, and he successfully did so when he disrupted the great music of Eru with his own medley. Several gods, who you can imagine might have later become Balrog, were attracted to Melkor at that time. But Tolkien specifically mentions that when Melkor approached Varda, perhaps to make music together, whatever that would mean, or perhaps to join him on one of his journeys into the void, which he loved to do, she just flat out rejected him. And why would he specifically mention that Varda rejected Melkor? If Melkor had any interest in the other female Varda, it was never mentioned, which means that his interest in Varda must have been pretty strong. You have to wonder, was it romantic? I don't know, I think it'd be hard to say. We know the Ainur weren't born with physical bodies, and even after they descended into the physical realm of Ea, their forms weren't the same as the bodies humans or elves had. The bodies of the gods were thought to be more or less like clothes, meaning they could change them at a whim, and if they wanted, they could go around without bodies altogether, and nothing bad would happen to them. But they did take husbands and wives while on Earth. And when that came up, Tolkien later clarified that even though the gods, the Valar and the Maiar, didn't necessarily have bodies, they did have identities as male or female that existed before they actually created their very own bodies on Earth. So in the case of the time before the universe came into existence, could we say that romance also existed? It might have, since all things came from the mind of Eru, and we would see marriage and romance as soon as the first beings walked the Earth. Knowing that, perhaps it was just companionship that Melkor sought from Varda. But in any case, Varda, the future wife of Manwë, flat out rejected him. She recognized that Melkor despised the work of Eru Ilúvatar, and that Melkor wanted to make things all on his own. But she didn't just reject him, she would later go on to marry, what I've said is essentially Melkor's brother, Manwë. Would this jealousy, the fact that the woman he desired later married his closest sibling, be enough to drive Melkor to commit greater acts of evil? By this point, we already know that Melkor was going to fight against the other gods on Earth. It was obvious, From the first time that he disrupted Eru's music, we knew that. But did Melkor become especially spiteful because of Varda's rejection? Tolkien says in his text that Melkor hated Varda the most. That sounds an awful lot like a lover scorned. He specifically wished her ill. If we think about it for a moment, why? Was it because that Varda, more than the other gods, had a hand in the creation of stars and lights? Melkor hated any light that originated from Eru, as he wanted to create and control things all on his own. So perhaps Melkor hated Varda, simply because she just represented that part of Eru that also liked lights and stars and starlight. Or, and I think this is more likely, Melkor was simply jealous. This was another person who he wanted, another thing that he wanted to put in his collection, and something else to control, but she refused to join him. And what happens when people don't get what they want? Well, they make sure nobody else can have it either. So when Melkor descended to Earth and started destroying all the continents and the seas that Manwë, Varda, and the other gods had so carefully created, was he not purely motivated by his own rebellious nature? Was he also not just pretty angry at Varda? After all, here she was, happily living with the 13 other Valar on Earth, and, Melkor was alone. Not only that, she took the only other being that was close to him, Manwë, as her husband. It's pretty complex, I don't think we could ever really break down Melkor's acts of violence on Middle-earth and truly figure out how much of it was based on revenge towards Varda and Manwë, and how much of it was just the fact that he was a rebellious type of Valar. Perhaps he would have always become a great, terrible, evil Dark Lord. But part of me thinks that if he had found a companion, the severity of his acts would have been greatly reduced, and instead of being a Dark Lord like we see in the Silmarillion, perhaps we would have just seen a mischievous god, who only revealed his jealousy by tricking the other gods in, relatively harmless ways.